Before I get into my little rant, I want to make sure there's no misconceptions. No, I don't think the game is on the brink of death, like some of the community would have you believe. I mean, the current player counts are objective proof that this isn't true. But despite this, I think there's a common sentiment that is undeniably damaging morale in the DVD community, and as a result of this, the game feels unfun a large amount of the time, and this is largely for a few reasons. One of these is that killer feels very hard. Yet for a lot of people this role is more fun, largely due to the mass amount of variety, unless you're one trick of course, whereas survivor feels miserable to play a lot of the time, yet they are undoubtedly very strong. Over the last 3.5 years, Survivor has received a lot of buffs as a result of the devs either responding to killer related changes or addressing quality of life issues. Examples of this are the anti-face camp mechanic, degenerator regression changes, mostly killing free gen strategies, base kit borrow time, the recent update to increase the amount of pallets on certain maps in order to supposedly fix dead zones, even though that was a lie, and with the exception of oppression and grim embrace buffs, pretty much every gen defense perk has been nerfed or changed in some way. Now, while most of these changes were a good thing, after all nobody wants to play against a face camping basement bubba, it is also undeniable that behaviour when it comes to fixing survivor frustrations such as getting tunnelled off hook or face camping, they tend to do it via giving survivors additional options or buffs rather than giving the killer incentives to avoid these playstyles. It's no wonder tunnelling has definitely gotten worse since the blood point incentives from barbecue and chili were nuked out of the game, which was arguably the biggest anti-tunnel feature in Dead by Daylight's history. But why has behaviour gone this route? After all, Dead by Daylight was originally never meant to be a serious game. It's clear they have no real aspirations for any sort of esports or competitive style of play. After all, they've essentially abandoned the emblem system and turned grades into just a monthly reward path, not a set of ranks that go up and down since the removal of losing picks. So why do they care that much about balance? Well, it's because players don't like it when they lose to something that is out of their control. Take the hatch for example. Sure, we love the hatch when we get it as a survivor or when we close it as a killer sometimes, but does anyone really like it as a mechanic? For most, the answer is no, as the hatch is completely RNG in its design, unless you bring a certain offer in, but in that case, that's simply a band-aid fix for only one side of the player base, which is something Dead by Daylight has done countless of times. How many times have they made a perk to deal with an issue instead of actually tackling the issue themselves, for example? I mean, I can name dozens. For killer, we have Mad Grit for anti-body blocking, Haywire to make the exit gauge regress, Corrupt Intervention for a slower early game, Dragon's Grip as a gen tapping counter back when that was a thing, Lightborn is anti-flashlight, Hex Undying is a counter for bad Hex Totem RNG, Make Your Choice and Pain Res are anti-tunnel incentives, Jagged Compass is a counter for bad Scourge Hook RNG, and finally, Bamboozle is one of the only counters against strong window loops for M1 killers. And the exact same thing happens on the survivor side as well. For example, Decisive Strike and Off the Record are anti-tunnel, Borrow Time was also anti-tunnel before it was base kit, Bond provides players with info on their teammates making playing solo better, Breakdown counters were using hooks, especially Scourges, Unbreakable and Boon Exponential are anti-slugging, Repressed Alliance is anti-gen kicking and anti-pop, Vigil is anti-mangled, Deliverance is anti-camping, and finally, Windows of Opportunity helps deal with bad map RNG, helps with survivor pathing, as well as just helping them learn the maps. These perks in one way or another addressed a major pain point one side had with either the other side, or just the game in general, hence why a lot of them are appealing, and despite behaviour's questionable judgment in sometimes using perks as a band-aid fix for their issues, they've gotten better over the years to some extent, such as the aforementioned free gen changes, which is probably the best change they've done over the last 3 years, as both sides got pain points addressed, and neither got screwed over. However, they've dropped the ball occasionally, and nothing sums that up more than the recently cancelled anti-slugging and tunnelling changes. These changes undeniably would have made Killer miserable, as it would have shoehorned them into just hooking every survivor the second they're downed, instead of performing smart plays such as downing a survivor, then going immediately for another survivor close by in order to continue building pressure. all while the anti-tunneling changes outright punish you for punishing the survivors for playing bad, while also screwing over a bunch of killer powers. What if a survivor walks into a bear trap or gets condemned by Sadako? Would killers just not be allowed to capitalise on this without being penalised? It's bloody ridiculous. Thankfully, this didn't happen, but the fact that it was even considered is madness. So why would behaviour even consider such a drastic, undeniably survivor-sided update? Well, it's because of what I said earlier. Both sides hate it when they suffer negative consequences for things out of their control. And when you look at it from that point of view, addressing tunneling and slugging makes total sense. After all, it's not fun to experience those things as a survivor. It's just miserable. But that begs the question, why does behaviour punish the killer for how they play, as opposed to incentivising the killer to play in a nicer way when it comes to dealing with these issues? Now, some would argue they are catering to new players, as at lower MMR, killer is widely regarded as the stronger role, and while this may be the case, I believe there's another reason for this, that being the massive killer imbalance. Let's be honest, we all know that balance in this game when you have killers such as Nurse, Blight, Karasu and Kaneki on one side of the power scale, with Skull Merchant, Trapper, Ghostface and Legion on the other side is impossible. So in turn, making any sort of game-wide changes on the killer side is also impossible, as any game-wide killer nerfs would cause weaker killers to become unplayable, but any buffs would cause the stronger killers to become even more oppressive than they already are, which is why I think behaviour prefers changing survivors to deal with game-wide issues, due to less factors being present, due to them having no power to take into account, with them not realising, or at least not fully grasping the fact, that just because the change is directed towards one side, doesn't mean it won't have rippling effects on the other. In fact, the opposite is always true, where it is impossible to change one side and not have the change affect the other in any way. The issue of killer imbalance also bleeds into perks as well. Think about it. If behaviour makes a very strong perk, it acts as a sort of crutch for weak killers, but probably creates a more balanced game for them. But on the stronger killers, these perks can be pretty oppressive. Proof of this was the first iteration of Hex Ruin. It was desperately needed to help weak killers deal with gen speed, especially since gen speed was only 70 seconds back then. But on killers like Nurse and Billy, who could traverse the map fast, unless you had bad early game totem RNG, they could protect the Hex totem relatively well, and Hex Ruin being alive for more of the game was both very strong and very miserable for survivors. So, it's undeniable that killer imbalance bleeds into so many aspects of the game, both from a gameplay standpoint and, I assume, a development standpoint as well. Because how do you balance the game with Nurse and Ghostface in the same role? Well, I think I have a solution. Remember, one of the biggest frustrations players have with this game is how much it feels out of your control, hence why mechanics like the hatch and the endgame in general can suck, and why perks that grant some form of control over those situations are so appealing. Now, I don't have a solution for every single annoying RNG scenario present in Dead by Daylight, but I do believe I have one that could solve the killer imbalance, which finally leads me to the title of this video. Maps. No, not those maps. Yes, those ones. Now, before I can explain my idea for what I would do to maps and how I would change them to help fix killer imbalance, first we need to understand what makes a killer strong and what makes a killer weak. Obviously, this is a little subjective, but I believe there are 4 aspects for a killer that contribute to their strength. Now granted, the killer doesn't need all of these to be good, but they all undoubtedly play a role in grading a killer's strength. The first is simple. How good are they in the 1v1, aka the chase? Everyone knows what this is how easily they can get the survivor from healthy, either onto the ground or onto a hook. The second is how good are they at the 4v1, which refers to how good that killer is at pressuring the whole team. Now as you'll see, all 4 aspects for killers all have a little overlap, as typically a killer that can down quick can get early hooks, allowing them to start pressuring other members of the team quicker. but certain killers also have abilities that can help pressure the whole team without the need for a chase, such as the Doctor's Static Blast and Madness, Freddy's ability to teleport to sleep survivors that are healing, pressuring often multiple at once, and the undoubtedly best killer for this is Pinhead with his box and chain hunts. This leads me to my third aspect of killer, which is their ability to slow the game down. Killers with strong chase powers or good 1v4 will naturally slow the game down a little bit, but there are some killers who may be weak in these areas but possess strong abilities which are specifically designed to slow the game down. The obvious example of this is the pig with her jigsaw boxes, as while it doesn't pressure the whole team or help her in chase, her traps are undoubtedly at least a top 3 slowdown ability in the game, probably number 1 against a good team. There are of course other slowdown abilities such as Pinhead's box, Madness, any killer who inflicts deep wound, any killer with an ability that needs to be cleansed like Wesker or Nemesis, all of these abilities that provide the survivors with additional objectives or annoyances outside of gens, taking their focus away from them, with them all varying in power. However, the final aspect is in my opinion the strongest thing when it comes to determining the killer's power, something you'll find among pretty much every top killer, and that is, how good is their traversal? Think about it. Good traversal affects every single one of the previous aspects. It allows the killer to find them precious survivors quicker, while also allowing them to detach and change targets easier if necessary, making their 4v1 better, while also often being a strong counter to Shift W, helping them in the 1v1, with a lot of traversal powers doubling as solid chase powers, such as Blight's Rush, Nurse's Blink, Spirit's Haunting, etc. Finally, if you're able to get to a survivor quickly, especially after hooking another, you're better at pressuring gens, especially with perks like Pop and Eruption, which slows the game down. The power of traversal is also proven by the fact that with the exception of Twins and arguably Singularity, every top killer has an incredibly strong traversal power, whereas the lower tier killers do not. Hence why despite a killer like Pig arguably having the best slowdown in the game, is still classed as weak, serving as a clear example of just how many aspects of the game traversal abilities affect. 1v1, 4v1, slowdown, traversal. These are what makes a good killer, and for the aforementioned reasons, traversal in my opinion trumps them all in terms of importance. This is the biggest difference between the high tier and low tier killers, and this is why map design is so important. A big map is fine for killers like Nurse or Blight or Dracula, but are borderline unplayable for killers like Pig, Deathslinger or Ghostface. And I don't think the devs realise this. My evidence is the recently cancelled PTB with the proposed tunnelling punishments, which would have been accompanied by anti-tunnelling incentives to compromise. Now, credit where credit's due. Behaviour realised that giving these incentives, bonus gem regression and survivor auras after a hook, at the same level of strength to a stronger killer as the weaker ones would be stupid. But notice how the incentive was to kick in gens after a hook, essentially a base kit pop goes the Weasel, instead of causing regression when a survivor is hooked like Pain Res. The difference matters, because with a base kit pop, killers would need to traverse the map to reach a gen after a hook, which is significantly harder for lower mobility killers since they can't traverse the map fast, and a lot of the time the gen would pop before you get there. They know who the strong killers are, but I don't think they understand why those killers are strong, or maybe they don't understand what makes the lower level killers weak. I don't know, but something ain't right. That being said, they can't just go and give every killer in the game a traversal power, as even if it was a balanced traversal power, giving one to every killer would make every killer feel kinda samey, as well as killing the identity of certain killers. Like, I don't know about you, but I don't want a teleporting Myers or flying Bubba. That would be ridiculous. That leads me to why changing maps is the solution, as it's the only option left, to be honest. So, with all this ranting and groundwork set for why killer imbalance is such a problem, and why I believe map imbalance is the solution, at least one of them, I can finally, 5 pages deep into my script, explain how I would change maps to fix killer imbalance, which would hopefully be a stepping stone towards a better DBD. However, unlike other video games like Overwatch, Marvel Rivals or the late Friday the 13th, where a map is just simply the specific location that match takes place in, the term map can actually refer to a few things in DBD that a new player wouldn't understand. A I'm of course referring to the difference between realms, maps and variants. So to start explaining my proposed changes, I first need to clarify what the difference between these three terms are. Let's start with realms. Realms are essentially a term for the theme of the map. For example, each license for DBD that has a map, most of them would take place in their own unique realm, such as Springwood for Nightmare on Elm Street or Gideon Meat Plant for Saw. There are of course original realms as well, most of which contain multiple maps such as Coldwind Farm, McMillan Estate and Autohaven Wreckers. In short, the realm is the unique aesthetic, skybox and lighting of maps, and maps within the same realm will typically share these attributes. Next up is maps. Maps. These are the actual playable spaces. There are currently 57 maps across 20 realms, with some being licensed, some being completely original, and some being mixed. For example, the Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria map obviously is a licensed map, though it takes place on an original realm, that being the Withered Isle. As mentioned before, maps in the same realm will have similar aesthetics, skyboxes and lighting, unlike maps that are in different realms. So, the main difference between every map, regardless of whether it's in the same realm or not, is that the main buildings, if the map even has one, will be completely different, as well as the locations of key structures, such as the Killer Shack and tiles, also being different. Here are some examples of this. So, that's what maps are. So what are variants? Variants. Variants are different versions of the same map. This means they not only take part in the same realm, but because they are different versions of the same map, instead of entirely different maps, they will possess the same main buildings and key structures. So, the difference between variants, and therefore the thing that justifies their existence, is that the location of tiles, the main building, and the Killer Shack, if the map has one, will be completely different, adding a layer of variety each time you play that map. Those are the three things the generic term map can refer to in Dead by Daylight, and with them explained, I can now break down my idea for a proposed sort of soft map rework that I think would be an astronomical jump towards better balance, without having to mass rework a lot of killers or go down some other route such as making perks act differently on each killer, which would be massively detrimental as it would increase the complexity of the game. My proposal is this. I wouldn't seek to change realms or maps, as I like the design choices behind them. I instead would change variants. What I would do is currently there are inconsistencies with variants, in that maps like Baden Preschool have 5, all the McMillan realms have 2, Mount Ormond has 3, the Europa realm maps have 2, and every other map in the game doesn't have a variant. I would start by changing this so that every map in the game has exactly 3 variants, no more, no less. Now why would I do this? Well, because in my vision, the design choices for variants would be different. As I mentioned before, right now the point of map variants is just to move the locations of key structures around in order to create variety, and while you could still do this, in my ideal scenario, this would not be the main goal of variants. Instead, the difference between variants would be the size. Each map would have 3 variants, 1 big, 1 medium, and 1 small sized. When you load into a match, just like it currently does, the game would, if no map offerings were used, randomly select a realm, then if that realm has multiple maps, it would randomly select a map from that realm. However, it would no longer randomly select a variant. Instead, the variant you would play on would be entirely dependent on which killer you were either playing or versing. So, for a killer with incredibly good traversal options like Nurse, Blight, Billy, Spirit, Ghoul, Dracula, etc., they would be played on the bigger maps, whereas killers with no mobility like Trapper, Myers, Pig and Ghostface would be on the smaller maps. The medium-sized maps would be for oddball cases. For example, Legion on big maps would be too weak, but depending on the size of the small maps, they could feel oppressive given Legion's ability to down on the 5th chain hit. Oni is another oddball as he's got a very strong power, but his snowball potential as well as his mobility are dependent on how easily he can get his power, which if the survivors are good, can take a while, with Oni not having much control over this, as most tiles are not designed to be favourable towards M1 killers. There are also killers with mobility powers not as good as the top killers like Springtrap and Onryo, who could fit better on medium-sized maps. Granted, there are killers like Twins, where I don't know what you do with them because they're strong, but they don't have any mobility necessarily. As a result, there would clearly need to be testing done for this system to work well. However, I think it would solve a lot of the issues in DBD. Think about it. Killers who don't have mobility wouldn't suffer from scenarios anymore when they get bad RNG, stuck on a big map, and they can't reach generators, essentially forcing them to attempt a free gen often. It would also make Shift W weaker against weaker killers, as on small maps, the volume of pallets would naturally be smaller as well, meaning there's less to break for those weaker killers, making the chance of survivors getting dead zoned higher. Also, you could take this pallet aspect of map variants a bit further by potentially having certain tiles or types of pallets only appear on bigger or smaller maps. An example of this would be God pallets not being on smaller maps, as most of the weak killers have no counterplay for them due to a lack of anti-loop abilities. It would also help killer perks, as some are in an odd spot currently, where buffing some of them would cause stronger killers to potentially abuse them, but by having those strong killers on different sized maps, the door could potentially be open to more perks and perk balancing ideas. For example, the effect of Haywire is something killers have been asking for ages. The problem is the perk only activates when the gates are at 80% and doesn't take effect below this. However, this currently has to be the case, as if the perk worked regardless of gate progress, a killer with a good traversal power like Blight or Billy could make this perk incredibly oppressive if they happen to get good map RNG, whether that be the location of the gates, or maybe they just happen to get Forgotten Ruins. No one would care if this perk worked at any point of the progress bar if it's being used by a Houndmaster when the gates are on, the opposite side of the maps, whereas Nurse would be a problem. Also, Hex perks I think would get a much needed buff from this as well. While the chances of a survivor spawning next to a Hex would obviously be higher on smaller maps, the overall frequency of Hexes being cleansed at the very start of the game I think would reduce due to slower killers no longer being screwed by getting a big map with a Hex on the opposite side. Essentially, it would be more difficult for a survivor to cleanse Hexes uninterrupted at the very start of the game, at least in theory. So, no more losing your ruin at the start of the game due to bad RNG. Now, I understand that this would undeniably be a grand undertaking to create essentially 86 new variants, not including current ones, but considering they wouldn't have to create any unique realms or tiles as they already exist, I think the idea is at least feasible, although I'm not a developer, so I could be wrong on that. Regardless, something needs to be done about the balance in this game, as killing, despite feeling fun at times, is undeniably weak right now, whereas Survivor, despite being massively buffed over the last few years, feels miserable to play due to less of the game being in your control. This map change would at least be a stepping stone towards a balanced game, as it would be behaviour recognising that in fact their game is unbalanced, something they haven't really outright said outside of the failed anti-tunnel and anti-slug PTB, where the hook incentives were going to be less on certain killers, but that update didn't even happen, although that definitely was a good fit. So, that's my proposed map changes, and to be honest, the only downside I could see is the game being made potentially more complicated when it comes to learning maps, and while yes, that is true, I'll take increased balance and bringing the killer power gap closer over the new players needing to learn maps a little better, especially when there's perks like Windows of Opportunity that does that for you at least partially. I truly think these changes would go a long way in making the weaker killers more viable without making the stronger killers OP, help loosen up behaviour in regards to being railroaded into only targeting survivors when it comes to game-wide changes, allowing them to do killer-wide changes, and by behaviour recognising their game is unbalanced with a change like this, we can start moving forward towards a more balanced DBD. God, I sound like a politician. That's my rant over. Okay, see ya.